Hi everyone, this is Ulf Andreasson here. I'm expecting to see quite a few number of people today, so we'll give everyone a couple of minutes for them to attend. For anyone who just joined, let's wait another kind of minute or so. I'm expecting to see quite a lot of people to attend, so we're gonna do. We'll give everyone some time to get on, and yeah. But let me also. I'm hoping you can find the chat and the Q&A window. If you have any questions while I'm presenting, then you can always ask those, and I'll either try to respond to that in person or kind of later on at the Q&A section in the end of it. So yeah, just going to give everyone a couple of more minutes to join. So, oops. Okay, that was a minute. So let's get going. So yeah, my name is Ulf Andreasson. I'm Swedish by birth, and I'm heading up the team here of system engineers for Sumo Logic in EMEA. So today we're really going to talk about application observability, and not just talk about it. I'm actually going to give you a demo. So I got a very few number of slides, but we'll kind of be spending most of the times in the demo. It'll probably take sort of something like 45 minutes. If I promise you anything else, then I probably would be lying. But hopefully you can bear with me. And there's also going to be a recording at the end of it. So, sorry, you will always have the possibility to kind of look back at that. But yeah, so my intention today is really kind of give you a brief overview of application observability with using Sumo. And then I'm effectively going to show you what we can do in Sumo, and specifically looking at a sort of Kubernetes-based service, microservices-based application, looking at the kind of service maps and traces and spans, and also see the experience from a user perspective. And in the end, I'll just give you a very quick glance of something we call global intelligence as well, with regards to my Kubernetes cluster that we're using here. So I'm hoping that's going to be good. And as I said, any questions, then put those in the Q&A window, and I'll either try to make room for those when I'm talking, or otherwise we'll take it at the end. So with that said, there's a number of different sort of aspects to the machine data that you need to look at when we talk about observability. Typically just observing something or just kind of monitoring something really means that you can be looking at, the metrics coming out, or kind of some simple view of what's happening. And you don't necessarily need all the data for that. It's metrics is kind of cheap, it can give you a lot of information from that perspective. Now, when you're going to start to diagnose any kind of symptom or problem that you're seeing, then you need a bit more data. You need to understand where things are happening. And, when you're going to troubleshoot something, that's really when you need most of the data, as in logs, traces, metrics, anything you can think of, right? And this is all to kind of be as quickly as possible to detect what's going on, sort of remediate what goes on. And of course, the more data you have, the better it is. Now, one good thing with Sumo is that you can actually have different data tiers, meaning that some data that you don't really search that often, you could put that into a tier, which maybe we call it infrequent, but basically you don't really pay much for kind of getting into Sumo. What you do is that you pay for the number of searches you do based on how much data we scan in those different searches. So it makes it really like you paying for the value of what you can get out from that data. Now, the data that's going to be critical to you, that's probably going to be more real-time data. And that is going to be more expensive in the sense of like, we're going to be able to, send you or provide you alerts with that. We're going to be able to kind of put those in a live dashboard and all those kind of things, right? But you don't necessarily need to have the majority of the data going into the real-time tier. So Sumo really helps you to kind of, pay for effectively what you use. And that's really good. And not just from a scalability or the amount of data you're sending in, but also the type of data. So that helps a lot. Now, when we start to sort of talk about ingesting data, Sumo really supports a vast majority of the kind of IT space, right? Anything from installed systems, on-prem devices, data centers, all those kind of things. You get a number of different options. You can use kind of a collector on every single server, or you can use a central collector. Those collectors can also be identified as a syslog receiver, and that will all be pushing data into Sumo. If you're already in the cloud, which many of you are, or at least part of your workload is running within the cloud, then there's no need to install anything. We just basically configure so that the data get pushed into Sumo. And what you probably all have as well is that you may be running AWS or one of the cloud providers. But what many customers are doing as well today is that you have a number of different cloud services. It may be GitHub or PagerDuty or Jira or Okta, all these kind of different tools. And, there's going to be a majority of those kind of tools being used and in conjunction with whatever cloud provider you're using. And then you probably have sort of more technical components or frameworks like containers, Kubernetes, all those kind of things. All of this data is being pushed into Sumo. And the beauty as well is that it is all secured from day one. You don't have an option to turn off or turn on security. It's always going to be secured. So we can grab a lot of different data sets. The other beauty here as well is that, if that data is unstructured, you don't need to do anything with it. You can choose to parse the data when you actually write the search query, or you can parse the data when you ingest it, because, if you try this data out, you know what you're going to use it for, then it does make sense to kind of parse the data when you ingest it, because your search is going to be quicker. But you don't have to do it. You do it when you know that this is the right time of doing it. If you're only going to do some experiments, you can push the data into Sumo, you pass the data in the search, and then you're good to go. And further on, you can start to kind of look at optimizations for that query, which could be anything from just parsing the data to using scheduled views or using different indexes and things like that. So there's a lot of capabilities you can use to kind of really help you kind of be efficient in how you're going to be using Sumo and effectively your efficiency in sort of getting responses quickly. Here's actually the data tiering, the continuous, frequent, and infrequent. There's actually a fourth one, which is archive, but that's kind of basically what it says on the tin, right? So that's kind of very much from a sort of generic perspective. Now, what we're going to be looking at today is kind of really the application. And yes, we are going to be looking at the infrastructure as well, or as an infrastructure from a Kubernetes perspective. We could go all the way down to the kind of EKS cluster and stuff like that as well, because this Kubernetes cluster is running an EKS, but it could be on-prem or whatever it is as well, right? And we're going to be using a couple of different ways of, both looking at it, identifying, sort of analyzing the data that comes in. And pretty much all of what I'm going to show you is out of the box. So there's no need to kind of develop or to do anything yourself. There's one dashboard that I am going to show you because that's kind of the application business overview, right? And but yeah, that's what we're going to do. So with that said, let's kind of jump into the application. And actually to kind of show the application as well, because it is pretty lame, lame but still effective. It's an application here where we call it the Sumo Logic coffee bar. So you can go and order your coffee, it may be an espresso. So let me do that. Or some of you guys may be kind of like the more traditional Americano. And then of course, we're going to have some tiramisu. Now, when I check this out, this is going to cost me $6. So I'm going to pay 10. And here I got the transaction that really took place. Actually, there seems to be some lack of requested products, Americano and tiramisu. So I do have some issues with this, but we'll kind of keep this. I probably won't use this trace, but it's just to kind of, I can use the trace if I wanted to. Now, what I also, of course, would have is that I would have sort of alerts within the system, and it could alert me using email. And, I may have a playbook for this, or I'm certainly going to have sort of different dashboards with different views that I want to show. And this could all be built out to kind of satisfy the person who's actually going to be looking at it, as in the operator. Doesn't necessarily is going to be the same as a developer, but it could be. Now, of course, you're also going to have various alternatives of using Slack or Teams or whatever you have. So, all of that we cannot take for granted in Zoom. Now, looking at the application, and actually, let me show you the application view. So, sorry, I forgot to open that up. But yeah, so this basically is an overview of my application. Now, I could just have a dashboard here, and this is not really rocket science, right? And it's kind of a bit lame as well, but I just put some names in here, the application owner, the Kubernetes lead and stuff like that. I could have any kind of, markdown text or links or, even like a panic button. So when I press this, I want something to happen. You can do stuff like that. Now, what's kind of more interesting is see the visitors over time, and also the kind of platforms they're coming in from. I may want to promote people using mobile phones to get into my application. So I could kind of see and track that. I could track the number of bookings over time, as in per hour in this case, but I could also track the type of booking. So how many Americanos versus cappuccinos versus espressos do I have? Is that something I want to try to influence? Can I kind of use this information to maybe kind of, lower the price or give coupons or whatever I want to do, right? Now, of course, the more interesting thing is the kind of payments over time. So, how many of these orders are successful versus failing? Luckily, I don't really have any failing orders right now, but that typically does come up in this application. And the other thing is, of course, this is just looking at successful versus failures. But as I know the dollar value, and that's actually part of my log line here, as I know the dollar value, I can actually include that and calculate the amount of dollars I'm getting per minute or per hour or, whatever measurement or time slice I want to use. Now, of course, you want to have sort of more technical things like latency in the orders and stuff like that as well. And then also what you could do is you could trigger sort of different metrics here. So here, basically, they see the number of orders. And do we have any sort of outliers? Do we see that this is fluctuating too much? You see, I'm hoping you can kind of see the red area here, or pink, maybe is a more correct color. And basically, this kind of shows us the variation. The variation of this is quite high. So it's kind of tricky, but it does kind of see that sometimes we kind of spiking up a bit earlier than maybe what we normally would do, or as in what normally this metrics is doing. Sorry, I just need to get some coffee there. But yeah, so this is all kind of trying to give you an overview of the application and how it does. Now, of course, I want to look at more at the details of this, and then, looking at the Kubernetes cluster that supports this. Effectively, I'm looking at sort of a deployment view, and I have a couple of different views when it comes to Kubernetes to look at. And we won't go into the other ones, but basically, if you are an infrastructure guy, you may be more interested to see what nodes do you have, and if you need to take one of those nodes offline, how would that impact, and what applications, what pods, what sort of components would be affected by you taking out that node, right? You may want to look at from namespace or service view, but I choose to kind of go with the with the deployment view. And so I got 4 clusters here, but this one, TCP SE prod, that's effectively what runs my application. Now, when I open up the cluster, I can see that I got a couple of different namespaces. And of course, you get the usuals in kind of Kubernetes, right? But I will select the coffee bar NS or coffee bar namespace. So now I'm looking at this from a Kubernetes perspective. And I can see I get a number of different pods that sort of start to be highlighted as red. I can actually dig into any of the logs here. So if I want to look at the machine service, I could actually go straight to those logs for the machine service, or I could go to the ones which has an error, or just looking at the signatures of them. So it's really easy, and that's kind of on pod level. If I want to do the same on a container level, I could do that too. And basically, there's a lot more information going down this list, right? There's kind of, you can see pretty much anything you need to, memory requests versus limits, CPU requests, CPU across the namespace, and I mean, I doubt that you're going to miss any specific data here when you look at this. Now, some of this is not fully populated because, again, it's a demo environment. But yeah, so you get an overview of that. But we're not necessarily, and by the way, one more thing, you can choose to kind of design any dashboards you would want to, and you can put those in here. So my business overview, I could put that in here as well and say that this is what I want to see on the kind of namespace level of the coffee bar NS. I haven't done that, but that's certainly something I could do, or actually I should do that. But yeah, so there's a lot sort of more information you could really dig into here from that aspect. Now, that said, this is just a Kubernetes environment. So I want to look at my application view, because that's really going to be interesting. And in fact, I have 2 applications here, but the coffee bar is what we're going to be looking at. So now suddenly I look at this from a latency or request or error percent, which kind of is typically what you would be looking at, right? And here you would not only, I mean, you get the kind of honeycomb charts and stuff like that, but you're also going to get the latency information, errors, and requests in sort of the numbers here. And I choose to have it there, or we choosing to have it there because it makes a lot of sense to kind of see the numbers as well, right? You can always see the numbers here when you kind of hover over it, but it's not going to be as easy maybe. Now, you can also see the service map of it. So here you can see my machine service. Here's effectively here's effectively the front end that we're using. And in fact, I have a Postgres database here as well, so sort of support me. But then basically, I also see the latency and the request and over time. So I can see that I got some severe spikes here, right? And I mean, there's so basically, there's a lot of good information here too. Now, this is kind of from a application overview, so to speak. And I can also have some other views of that too, right? Now, what I also may want to do, so this is kind of looking at the application in the back end, so to speak, in my AWS environment where I run the application. And but what I may want to do as well, take a look at it from a user perspective. So looking at this application from a run or from a sort of run perspective, or effectively the real user monitoring, how quickly can I see the page when I load it? What is the kind of aspects of taking time here? The DNS resolution is quite quick. I mean, I wouldn't expect anything else. Time to interactive can take some time, but basically the page load end here is kind of, fairly high, or those are the kind of major spikes here, right? So this kind of really helps me to see from a user perspective, how quickly is this page loading? What sort of browsers are people using? Or what sort of operating systems are they coming from? So there's a lot of those aspects you need to kind of look at as well as what, maybe my CDNs, how is that impacting thing, or how am I kind of seeing this, right? So we're trying to give you all that information too. And actually there's a couple of variants of that. So you can see a kind of page load in this way, and just trying to give you the data in as sort of good way as possible. And you can then kind of also focus on whatever sort of information you want to look at, right? So time to interactive here, for example, or, and what type of number you want to look at, what type of statistic you want to look at. So you can influence this kind of thing as well, right? But just making sure we kind of give you a good overview of that. So, seeing the kind of the latency information, stuff like that. What you also can do then is kind of look at this from a service map point of view. And it's not, we've already looked at the kind of tiny one, but again, looking at this can kind of help you see things from top down. Now you can see that you get a couple of sort of outliers here. And basically, I can influence this as well. So now I'm just using the automatic anomaly detection from a latency perspective. But I could use a manual way to detect any sort of anomalies here. And I can then define what I'm looking for. So that could help me a lot in sort of really looking at what I want to see, not necessarily what Sumo recommends. So that's one way of doing it as well. But that said, we see, or I know that we have some issues with the machine service here most of the times. And we also did see that my order didn't go through when I tried to. So what I can do here is that, looking at this, Sumo allows you to sort of pivot into different data sources or data types, depending on what you're looking at. And we don't necessarily know what you're looking at. So therefore, just kind of clicking on the machine service, we allow you to go into any of these kind of data types. So in my case here, I want to look at the traces. So this is basically all the kind of tracing that's taking place between the machine servers. And in this case, we have the front end as being kind of the requesting service there, right? Now, this is going to include all the kind of different services. What I want to do is I want to filter out the ones which basically has some kind of error. So any sort of trace that has more than 0 errors. Now, I can just kind of hover over this and it's going to tell me the different spans within that trace. When I click on the trace, I'm getting into the span itself, right? So here I got the complete sort of timeline for that transaction or for that sort of trace. Now, when I start to look at this, I can actually see the click on pay, which is effectively the front end. Once I sort of clicked on it, once I sort of requested my things, it then went back to the kind of HTTP post client and basically went to the back end. Now, kind of, this is a bit busy, but what I can do, just kind of use the wheel on the mouse and I can move things around or just open it up, so to speak. And I can kind of see where I got my error here, which basically stops at this post. It's a post that says get beans, so it's going to get the beans to the coffee machine. So something's failed here. And I can quite easily kind of get to the information about this. Here I see the kind of process here, get beans. I have a lot of different metadata, all the tracing data, kind of span events. So we're getting the type of events as part of this as well. And we can see that there's an exception. We can see that this is part of a Kubernetes cluster and all those kind of good things. Now, what I want to do is I just want to see what went wrong. So I can do that because when we collect the logs, metrics, and traces, or effectively when we collect logs and metrics, we also tag all the information with the kind of trace and span ID. And I could be looking at this from a trace ID, but that's going to be sort of everything. So I just want to see this kind of span and what happened within that span at that point in time with this kind of transaction. And doing so makes a very simple search. And basically, I quite quickly can see that the reason this is failing is that there's a lack of coffee beans in the machine. So effectively, the machine ran out of coffee beans, and that's why it failed to make the coffee at that instance. Now I can just go and sort of fill up the machine with some more coffee beans and make sure that this is not going to happen again, right? That's probably what I would do, or that's what I will do. But yeah, that's kind of the, conceptually easy to understand. But the point here is how I can move around, how I can look at the service map, move into the kind of, to the components or the microservices that is of my interest, and then sort of pivot into, the logs, the traces, whatever it may be. In my case, I kind of choose to go into traces and then sort of from the trace or the span into the logs to kind of really see that. We can do all this because basically we have all the data in Sumo. We make it easy to collect all that data, and we kind of make it really useful to be able to pivot and move around and kind of look at the data that you would want to look at. Now, this is very much from the top down. So we look at the application from sort of an overview, so to speak, and really dig down into the logs of it. I could also do something differently. Because what we can do is kind of spans today is almost what a log line is for, what was before. So if I want to say, I want to look at one of these services here, and I'm going to take the cache disk. Now, I want to look at this from a duration and just looking at the average. I then want to time slice this by 1 minute, and then I want to look at the status code. So this is a fairly simple, yet we haven't written it in sort of, we use a basic interpreter here to just define what I'm looking for. But when I run this search, I'm going to see the aggregates, right? What this really gives me is a number of different spans that sort of is within my request. So it's all with regards to the cache disk. It's all with regards to the kind of the different sort of the different status codes it's going to give me, and sort of the average of duration. So I could slice and dice this. Now, maybe a better representation of this would be to have a column chart. And at this point in time, we're only looking at the last 15 minutes. So let me look at the last 6 hours. Now, this could be quite interesting because I did see that I had a lot of 402s, and actually I was hoping to have some 500s as well. But if nothing else, I kind of see that I get a very high 402 here, and I get a bunch of those, right? So something is not working from time to time. Now, that could be interesting. And of course, I need to do some more digging into this. But what I could do, if I want to join sort of more, or if I want to correlate this with some more logs or some more information here with regards to those, I could just open up this in a search. So this kind of takes you back to the normal searches we would do in Sumo when we look at a log line. A trace is not really far off from a log line. It's just that most of the times the traces doesn't actually include that much text. That's something that we foresee is going to happen sort of as we go along, right? The more people are using tracing, the more text is going to be part of the spans, and suddenly it will start to look a lot more like log lines. Now, when I when I look at this, it's all in the information here, and we've just kind of made sure that we're picking up the things that we want to see, right? Which basically came from the previous one. But, and I can, represent this in the same way as I had it before, right? So what I would want to do here is, of course, to kind of use blogs and correlate that with other things as well. Now, what I also can do is that if there's any kind of specific, now I'm not going to use this query, right? But basically I could just go and say, I want to add this to monitor. And a monitor is really the way for us to set up an alert. So I'll dig into this one here instead and go for the monitors that we have as part of a system. And let me take one of the Kubernetes monitors. So, for example, if I get some multiple containers being killed because of out of memory, right? I could then basically see that what we're looking at here is the kind of number of restarts in total. But then we also look at the number of restarts or terminated ones, which basically has an out of memory killed. And then we effectively do an A plus B. So we can kind of look at the complete number here. Now, I don't really have much of this. But the point is that you can create a query. It can be based on logs or metrics. It can be based on static thresholds or outliers. So effectively some sort of deviation of what you normally would expect. And then what you would do is you would just define, how do I want to notify anyone if something happens? Do I want to use kind of Slack, or do I want to use anything else, PagerDuty or Jira's or whatever it may be, right? You can just kind of create whatever connection, and then you can make sure to sort of include that, and you're going to be able to do it here, right? Then you can have playbook information, you can give it some more description, you can do all of those good things. Then you can also say what type of alert is this, and am I going to be recovering from that alert as well if need be? And it could just be that the data is not coming in, so I want to be alerted for that too, right? So a couple of different things there. What would happen in Sumo once we start to fire those alerts is effectively that you're going to see the kind of alert response monitor here. And this would just show you the different sort of alerts that are active, including the ones which we already resolved. And let's take the payment service here, for example, which is a different sort of application. But basically, we then kind of showing you what a query triggered the alert, what sort of conditions we saw. We can see the log message of this query, how it sort of manifests itself. And then we also try to give you some more context in the way of like, can we give you information that could potentially help explain this behavior? And, we're doing there's a lot of machine learning and other smart technologies going on here in the background to give you this information. Now, we can also look at the kind of alerts here. So from a timing perspective, in the last 30 minutes, we have these kind of other 13 alerts. So are they sort of, could you correlate that in some way? Or we could be looking at the entity itself. So effectively, does this kind of payment service, does that have any other alerts that could be sort of a reason for this? And of course, you could be looking at the monitor's history as well. So how often is this fired? Is this maybe not a brilliant monitor in the sense of that we could tweak this, make it more sort of restrictive, or kind of, increase the thresholds or whatever it could be, right? So that's kind of something you can do as well. So with that, I think I've covered most of things from the application point of view that we were talking about. Now, I do have, I do have another thing I wanted to show you too, because one of the benefits that Sumo has is that we have sort of, over 2,000 or closer to 3,000 customers using Sumo. Now, anonymizing all that data gives us a really good understanding of what's happening within different aspects of the kind of services that customers are using, right? One of those services is effectively using sort of Kubernetes. So when we look at, let me see. When we look at the usage of Kubernetes, we can look at things like adoption. That's very simple in the sense of like, okay, if I'm looking at this, how am I sort of, my company, how much have we adopted Kubernetes versus what we call the kind of GIS benchmark, or, effectively the kind of the amount of all our customers we have using Kubernetes, we see that roughly kind of 3.68 clusters per customer is using it, while I'm kind of using 3 clusters here, some slightly below. On the other hand, the number of deployments I'm using is actually quite much higher compared to what sort of normally our customers would do. Now, that's not necessarily the most important thing, right? What I would kind of look at is actually more the details of Kubernetes deployment. So I can choose to kind of look at maybe a specific namespace. Let's take the TCP cluster here. And I am on a pretty weak network link here, so that's probably where it takes a bit of time. But basically, what we're trying to build up here is to say, when we look at your cluster, how, have you configured that from different aspects, as in container memory, CPU usage, or let me put it like this: we look at it from a usage perspective as well as a usage perspective as well as a no, sorry, let me take this dashboard instead. That's the one I wanted to use. So yes, how well are we optimized for what we're seeing here? So if we take this one and we take the CCB prod, we're going to see that my kind of the amount of memory here, we fairly evenly kind of using the amount of memory. There's some risk with this, as in, we could be using too much or could try to request too much, but that sort of very much depends on, and you could kind of slice and dice this here, more looking at specific deployment maybe, or also kind of looking at how much of the current data that you've ingested is actually a history representation, or effectively how much of that data is not sort of representing what you typically do. So if you're doing a lot of testing and evaluations, then maybe the data you see is not sort of represented in the best possible way, so you can tweak that to some extent. So from a memory perspective, it's not too bad. From a CPU perspective, it's also not too bad. The risk is pretty zero. So, I mean, I'm not sort of really have any problems at all from that perspective. Now, if we wanted to, so it all depends what I'm selecting here. If I go back to this one, you saw that I had a lot more risk percent. So effectively, we're using a lot of memory and there's a risk of overusing it. So if I wanted to sort of go in and look at this from a action plan, I could do that too. And we would effectively go and say, we see that you're using these different sort of services or deployments in here. And for example, FluentD is using a lot more resources compared to what is scheduled for. So this is probably one of the things that kind of causes the memory request there to kind of be very high, or the risk percent to be very high. So we would recommend you to lower that because it's basically, it doesn't sort of make a lot of sense. While other things, we would recommend you to increase the kind of the infinite loop reverse here. So different containers kind of basically has different sort of limitations here, and we would just basically kind of try to guide you. We would even kind of give you the absolute number that we were recommending that you should be using. So it's not like you, of course you can see that in here as well, but you could just basically copy and paste this and kind of take that into look at what you've been looking at. So, just quick and dirty on that one. But the point here is that we have monitored multiple clusters over time. We've been collecting sort of information from how you typically would configure and what would be the best practice in configuring those clusters. And that's how we can then sort of help to guide you. So this is not just showing what other customers are typically configured for, but also doing a lot of smart sort of analytics of what that data represents, and then present that back to you in a sort of useful and insightful way. So that's kind of really what I wanted to show you. And so with that said, just kind of tell you again what we were doing. We looked at the Kubernetes cluster, but basically we then sort of dived into actually looking at the health and tracing information about the application. All of this is automatically sort of, this is all automatically analyzed. When we look at a Kubernetes cluster and the kind of applications in there, we all kind of just automatically, able to show you the service map, kind of understand the application from the interaction between the different microservices. And of course, you could be tagging the applications as well with more information, but basically most of this is sort of automatically deduced from the system. Now, looking at any of those kind of services in there, we specifically looked at the machine service, because I know that we got some issues with that, and we can kind of dive into it through the traces and basically be going into the logs of that to really see what was the problem in the logs associated with a specific span. That really helps you pivot and understand quite quickly what the problem is with regards to your application. Now, we did that from sort of top down, but we can also do this from bottom up, and in looking at spans and effectively doing searches there, like we would do search a log line. So that's kind of very similar to a log search, although, still sort of gives you a lot of information and a lot of ways to understand the kind of spans and traces rather than actually just looking at logs or anything like that. And then I kind of showed you how we could effectively create a monitor so that we would get an alert when something like this happens the next time. And then we would be able to kind of monitor those alerts or kind of, make sure that we are addressing those alerts and sort of taking us out from that sort of instance in the first place. So that's pretty much what we were talking about. A couple of more minutes, but basically, any questions from that perspective? I see one question here in the chat, and that's basically down to how are you being charged for kind of using Sumo and specifically using sort of spans and traces in Sumo. And that's quite easy. It's basically based on the amount of data that you ingest to us. So when we talk about logs, it's effectively the length of log line or the size of the log lines that you're sending to Sumo. When we talk about traces, it's the same thing, the number of spans and typically the size of the spans. So it may vary, like log line may vary, but that's basically what you're paying for. So the ingest into Sumo in gigabytes. There's a lot of smart things you can do there. You can exclude data, you can exclude sort of parts of a log line. So you can be very specific with what you want to include or ingest and what you don't want to ingest. You can also mask and hash data if you need to do that. And with regards to metrics, it's just basically the amount of metrics. And we don't have any notion of kind of custom metrics or anything like that. A metric is a metric, and that's just the number of metrics that are being sent into Sumo. So it's quite easy to kind of, to understand that. Yes, and there's another question about the number of integrations number of integrations in Sumo. So basically, we are trying to give you as much kind of, let me show you the app catalog here. So we're trying to give you as much sort of out-of-the-box content as possible. Which really means that, most of the known technology is out there, like any of the AWS services or GCP or Azure services. We typically already have an understanding of those. Kubernetes, databases, web servers like Apache, Nginx, all these kind of things, right? Docker, VMware. We're trying to give you as much as possible, so it's easy to kind of just go and collect the data, and you can just kind of provide the out-of-the-box content here. So if you want to monitor your Slack channels, you can do that too. So this is not just about sort of what runs in AWS or on a server. It's actually a lot. I mean, looking at this from a DevOps perspective, we have a lot of sort of integration tools and CI/CDs and GitHub and all these other things so that we can effectively build a complete and comprehensive picture of what you're using for your IT infrastructure. So that's kind of there as well. So I think those are the questions that I can see. Anything else, then just let me know. We also have a Slack channel here, so you can always use that. I'll put this in the chat window as well. So there's a Slack channel, and of course you can always kind of go to Sumo, to one of my colleagues, or reach out to myself. You can also try it using Sumo. It's We open for kind of a free trial for 30 days. Play around with Sumo and kind of see what you think. And if you need any help, then let me know. There's a lot of other events and webinars and search jams and things like that. So sumologic.com/events. You can see that there. And as I said, if you want to reach me, you can just send an email to Ulf at Sumo Logic, or to just reach out to any of my colleagues. So thank you very much for spending the time with me today, and I hope it was useful. And as I said, anything we can do, let us know. Okay, thank you. Bye.